and fuel. So they were limited mainly to operating in British waters, as had largely been the case during the First World War. And as you can see on the map on the right-hand side, all the little red dots, which represent U-boat sinkings up until May 1940, are well within range of the UK and the coast of France, with really none of them any further west than Iceland. And during this same time frame, there was some attempt on the part of the German Navy, as Admiral Raeder had wished, for surface commerce raiding. But as with the outbreak of the First World War, this had limited success because, again, the German surface raiders, which operated in small groups, were really vulnerable to the more powerful Royal Navy. So there was only so much damage that they could do in exchange for the costs that were involved in this service raiding activity. The situation in the Atlantic, the strategic situation, changes dramatically in the middle of 1940. And the reason for this actually has nothing to do with naval warfare. It has to do with the fall of France, the capitulation of France after the German invasion in the spring of 1940. And the occupation of Norway, Denmark, Netherlands, and Belgium are also relevant here. Because whereas earlier in the war, as in the First World War, German submarines had a long trip from their bases in North Germany out into the waters of the North Sea and the waters of the Atlantic on the western approaches to Britain. Now they have the luxury, the Germans have the luxury of building naval bases anywhere that they want to on the entire western coast of Europe. And this also makes it virtually impossible for the British to enforce any kind of blockade against Germany because Germany simply controls too much coastline for that to be practical anymore. But for our interests here, what really matters is that the Germans can now build submarine bases, like the one you see in the photograph at lower left, all along the coastline of the Bay of Biscay off of the French coast. And they have therefore much more range to get out into the middle of the Atlantic, unlike when they had to go through the Baltic Sea and, in between Denmark and Sweden and out into the North Sea. So the U-boats simply are able to attack shipping closer into the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Now, why does this matter to the Allies? Well, because up until the fall of France, more or less, the Allies had been using convoys. There was no question that the Allies would use convoys. But they were only escorting the convoys for parts of the journey across the Atlantic from, say, Halifax or St. John's to the UK. So naval escorts were traveling with the convoys out of Newfoundland up until this point, south of Greenland, where you see sort of a curved purple line. And then through the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, where the convoys were basically out of range of German submarines, they were on their own. And then they would be picked up by new escorts coming from the UK for the final approaches to the UK or Ireland, which were the most, Northern Ireland that is, which were the most dangerous, which was the most dangerous part of the journey. But now that the Germans are able to venture further into the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the Allied escorts now have to cover more of that gap. They can't leave the convoys unattended. So this is basically placing more strain on the Royal Canadian Navy, the Royal Navy, and the U.S. Navy in their labor-intensive escort duties. And you may be surprised that the U.S. Navy was already involved in the U-boat war or the submarine war in 1940 and 1941, because of course the Americans didn't go to war until December of 1941. But the American President Roosevelt is already supporting the Western Allies and is willing to allow the U.S. Navy to engage in convoy escort duty in conjunction with the Royal Navy and the Royal Canadian Navy. Another factor from the Allied perspective that limits the damage at this stage of the submarine war is that the Allies are able to read German naval signals sent by radio because they have broken the German naval code, which is a product. These messages are coded with a ciphering machine that the German forces use called the Enigma machine. And unknown to the Germans, the Allies, as of March 1941, are able to read German naval signals because they've cracked the secret of the Enigma machine. Some of you may have seen this recent film, I think it's the Imitation Game, perhaps, if I have that right, which is about Bletchley Park and the Ultra operation, which was the British effort by mathematicians and other academics to break the German ciphering device known as the Enigma machine. So as of March 1941, the Allies were actually able to read German naval signals and therefore try to avoid areas where submarines were known to be lurking. But nevertheless, because the U-boats now have extended range from their new French bases, you see that the little red dots representing sinkings are moving further out toward the middle of the ocean. The situation really begins to heat up in the summer of 1941 up until early 1942. What key developments do we have here? First of all, the Germans are pushing their patrols of U-boats, of submarines, further and further west. So now you can see that there are sinkings spread all over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, from Greenland all the way down to the western coast of Africa. Secondly, the Germans are implementing new tactics known as Wolfpack tactics. Up until this point, including in the First World War, submarine attacks were usually launched by lone submarines operating by themselves. Now the Germans are trying something different from a tactical standpoint, which is an effective measure to defeat the defensive capacities of the convoys, the escorted convoys. And that means attacking with multiple submarines at the same time. The way it works is that if a German submarine is out on patrol and it spots a convoy, maybe there are 20 or 30 ships in the convoy and 3 or 4 escorts, naval escorts, it doesn't attack immediately. It sends a radio transmission back to U-boat headquarters in France, and U-boat headquarters retransmits that information to all of the other U-boats that are within range of the original patrol U-boat. And the patrol U-boat waits for those other U-boats to come and gather with it, and they all attack the convoy together. And by attacking the convoy with 5, 6, even 7 submarines, sometimes more, they're able to overwhelm the capacity of the naval escorts to protect the convoy. And these Wolfpack tactics, as a result, can do drastic damage to a convoy, some cases sinking up to a quarter of the ships in the convoy. And the 3 or 4 escorts simply can't cope, especially when they're being attacked at nighttime. But in any case, now the Allies have no choice, because of the spreading risk of submarine attack, to escort the convoys from one end of the ocean to the other without any breaks. From Halifax and St. John's all the way out to the convoy destinations, wherever they happen to be in Britain or elsewhere. During the winter of 1942, for about another year, up to the winter of 1943, it almost appears that the Germans are going to win the Battle of the Atlantic, that they're going to overcome the capacity of the Allies to send convoys of supplies, agricultural produce, soldiers, military equipment from North America to Britain. And there are a number of factors that come into play here. One of these, ironically, is the American entry into the war against both Japan and Germany in the end of 1941, into the winter of 1942. Now, one would think intuitively that if the Americans are now formally involved in the war, that they're going to have an even greater role to play in terms of escort duties in the Atlantic. But in fact, for the time being, the opposite was true, because much of the U.S. Navy escort fleet that was operating in the Atlantic hitherto is now going to be transferred to the Pacific for operations against the Japanese. So the Allies actually lose escort capacity after the U.S. enters the war. This puts more and more pressure on the small Royal Canadian Navy, but the growing Royal Canadian Navy, to do more of the escort work. A second development here is that because the Americans are now belligerent, because they're now formally at war with Germany, the German submarine commanders and German naval headquarters are not at all afraid of offending American opinion by attacking shipping directly in U.S. waters. Look at all the red dots that are off of the coast of North America on this map. The Germans are basically having a field day attacking merchant shipping moving along the coast of North America, particularly in a north-south direction along the U.S. coastline. And one of the reasons that they are able to attack shipping so successfully is that the American officials, American naval officials, are not convoying their coastal traffic, and they're not blacking out the cities on the coast at nighttime. So you have the east coast of the U.S., cities like New York, Boston, wherever, all lit up, and tons of merchant shipping traffic going up and down that coast, which is clearly silhouetted against the brightly lit ports at nighttime. All the German submarines have to do is sit outside the port, submerged, wait for night to fall, and then choose their targets. And you can see the disastrous consequence of this poor U.S. policy with all the sinkings that are occurring in the western Atlantic, right up against the coast of North America. Another serious problem for the Allies is that the Germans upgraded their naval Enigma machines, their Enigma ciphering machines, in this phase of the war, and this shut out Allied signals intelligence gathering through most of 1942. Now, the Germans didn't know that the Allies had been reading their naval signals, but as a matter of routine, they upgraded the machine to make the codes tougher to break, and those who were working in the UK at Bletchley Park in Ultra had to start out practically all over again to learn how to decipher or break the cipher on these codes sent in the new Enigma device. And the practical consequence was that the Allies lost about 6 million tons of shipping to submarine attack in 1942. It was the worst phase of the war for shipping losses, and was really beginning to become a serious problem in strategic terms. And yet, by the middle of 1943 or the fall of 1943, the situation is once again reversed, and the Allies are able to turn the tables. How do they do this in the wake of the disasters of 1942? Well, first of all, the Allies implement stronger escorts with better equipment for anti-submarine work. Probably the most important piece of equipment that they have for this purpose is shortwave radar. Now, in contrast with sonar or ASDIC, which could only be used to detect submarines underwater, Radar is only useful for detecting submarines on the surface.